Without further ado, I will turn it over to Colin.
Great. Thank you for the invitation, Joe, and the organizing committee for BostonCHI. I'm going to go ahead and get my slides shared here. Thank you so much for allowing me to present on this work. This has been a growth over the last 4 or 5 years that I've been doing work in relation to dark patterns. And certainly the space has changed dramatically just in these last 5 years that I've been investigating the idea of dark patterns and thinking about what the ethical complexity of UX and technology practices are more broadly. I lead a program here at user experience design at Purdue University, and so I've gotten a chance to sort of see firsthand not only the development of the designers, but also through this research, what the real deal is that people are dealing with out in technology practice and the ways that we can maybe better understand some of those threats. In the past few years, I've been focusing primarily on talking about dark patterns and sort of the ethical complexities, but increasingly I feel like we need a light out at the end of the tunnel, not just because of the pandemic, but also just because we want to see that there's a sense of hope and a sense that we as designers can do something about some of these issues. And so that third piece, the potential for action, is an area that our lab is working directly on right now. So as I get a little bit further into the talk, you'll see a little bit of what we've been up to over the last year and where we hope to go over the next year. So the idea of using persuasion to manipulate people to buy product is not new. And in fact, every time you walk into a grocery store, you're surrounded by products that people want you to buy. You are being surveilled from up above. Your walk is being mapped through the store. They've carefully selected product at various levels to encourage you to buy things that you might not want to buy otherwise. And in fact, grocery stores are some of the most technology-rich environments that we experience on a day-to-day basis, even without us realizing it, even before the whole Amazon Go phenomenon. And of course, this is true of advertising more broadly. Advertising is all around us. We're surrounded by millions of advertisements as we go through our lives. The average 5-year-old has already seen many, many ads in the millions. And so this is not anything new. But if we go back to the 1960s, we can start to see this not only emergence of marketing techniques, but also the streamlining of these techniques to really present this golden era of advertising. A lot has changed in our society since then. Our technology situation has certainly changed, but many of the tactics used to coerce, convince, persuade, manipulate us into doing things is still alive and well. It's just taken on new forms, which potentially are much more powerful and much more difficult to ignore than some of the marketing techniques of eras past. The other thing that makes this really challenging is that the role of design has changed. And all of you probably feel this in your own professional careers. You're seeing the dramatic shift in design work and design careers over the last decade or two is quite amazing to see. I trained originally as a graphic designer, right, sort of at the dawn of the World Wide Web, at least on the commercial sense. And just to see the kinds of job roles that have emerged over the last 20 years has been pretty outstanding. And this is something that design theorists and design philosophers have noted for a long time. And so the diagram that I have up on the slide here is from Richard Buchanan, who talked about in the early 1990s about these 4 orders of design. The fact that, you know, in the past, in the Bauhaus sense, we had people that designed visual communication systems, these symbol systems, and we had people that designed things or objects. And so these are the industrial designers or the product designers. But increasingly, we're moving away from those things that are tangible and visible and really easy to put our hands around and understand. And we're designing the interactions and experiences that people are having. And we're designing the systems in which all of that kind of work can exist as well. And so what that means is that increasingly we're pushing design work into these abstract and invisible spaces that are much more difficult to understand, much less control. And that is presenting new possibilities, but also new challenges for people in a range of different design disciplines. Now, dealing with some of these ethical threats is not anything new for designers. And so in some ways, we're harking to the past to understand how designers, our forebears, have dealt with some of these issues in their own practice. And so Milton Glaser, a noted graphic designer in the mid-20th century, described this road to hell for marketing designers and advertising designers. a series of questions that you started off and you're like, I think I'd be okay with doing that. And by the time you get down to the very end, you maybe question, is that something that I am morally okay with? Is that something that my profession should even be doing? And how do I know the difference between what things I'm willing to do and what things I'm not willing to do? And in fact, even noted industrial designer Victor Papanek back in the 1970s titled one of his book chapters, "Do-It-Yourself Murder," to describe the various atrocities that industrial designers could unleash upon the world. Now, nothing's really that different these days. The angle has shifted maybe from advertising design to other contexts. And in fact, earlier this year, I think it was just early last year, somebody published 12 new steps on the road to design hell, thinking about this from an intersectional and social justice perspective, to really think about what are all the things that we are commonly asked to do as designers, for me as an educator as well as a designer, and thinking through which of those bridges are we willing to cross, which are we not, and why. And as user experience designers, this brings in lots of additional complexity across the socio-technical spectrum, because we're not just dealing with products or visual communication systems that are created once and then used in ways that are relatively predictable. We're generating systems that are being adapted and changed in real time and being used by millions and millions of users, if not billions. And so this presents many, many challenges that many of our disciplines haven't thought about in depth, and certainly the regulatory and policy frameworks through which our work is mediated is also not really up to the challenge. And yes, I'll be happy to share the slides afterwards. And if any other questions pop up while we're going through the presentation, I'm happy to make this as interactive as all of you are interested in making it interactive. We do have a Q&A session at the end, but pop questions in there. If I'm going to be addressing it later in the talk, I'll probably just acknowledge that. But if it's something that looks like it would be worth responding to in the moment, I'm happy to do that as well. I've learned to multitask teaching online during the pandemic. So dark patterns has entered the public discourse in a lot of different ways. And so it's a known quantity, at least for the design and technology community. And increasingly, it is making its way into the popular press, in the technology press as well. And so you can see across a wide range of different kinds of venues, whether it be the Atlantic or whether it be Ars Technica, that people are talking about these issues, both sort of in the general sense that people are manipulating you and you are being manipulated, and in a more specific sense, talking about specific case studies where dark patterns are being used that have really dramatic social impact. And probably the biggest case of that in this past year has been Trump's campaign website, where after the election, there was an auto opt-in to continue donating for an extended period of time using many known dark patterns, and it was remarkably successful. And of course, our social media sites engage in a lot of these same practices. Some of them try to be more responsible about their dark patterns uses. Others still have a lot of work to be done. Now, dark patterns, as it originally existed, was a term created by designers for designers. So we're all already in on the secret. But increasingly, over the last 5 years, a lot of other perspectives have emerged as well, from psychology, from ethics, visual design, policy, law, and many other perspectives. And so there are many more people that are interested in this discourse than I might have expected even 5 years ago when I started doing research in this space. Thought it was going to be a niche topic that would interest few, and that actually has turned out to be something quite different. And so increasingly, we're seeing dark patterns existing as this almost convergent synthetic concept that can bridge disciplinary interest across the spectrum for many of these different disciplinary perspectives. And that to me is one of the most exciting things about where the conversation around dark patterns is going. It's away from just saying designers should do better work, which I certainly agree they should, and towards what are we going to do about it? And to do something about it, we need many different voices from many different perspectives to make stuff happen. Now, as a graphic designer by training, this is my version of evil design. One of my favorite, the typeface Helvetica, designed to have the most horrible kerning that you might possibly imagine. But the idea of engaging in dark and evil design with very intentional purpose, and also with the potential for very dramatic social impact, is not new. In fact, we have this history of redlining that has historically provided unequal access to housing for people depending on the color of your skin. And there are many other examples that have come up through the Black Lives Matter movement and other social justice movements over the last couple of years that have revealed many ways in which our systems that around our society are stacking the deck against certain people more than others. And dark patterns is no different. Psychologists are remarking that these persuasive design principles that are being used are often leading directly to technology addiction. In fact, some of the core texts on doing persuasive design frame addiction as in a good way, in a positive way, where we want to have more dwell time, more screen time. And in fact, many of the metrics that you might be judged by in your own jobs might be situated around these same kinds of issues. But often the people who are harmed the most are the people who are the most vulnerable. And so recently the FTC held a workshop back in April on the threat of dark patterns and thinking about what we can do about this from a regulatory perspective. And children were one of the key demographics that we can see potentially having a much more outsized form of harm because they're early in their developmental cycle, they're still cognitively developing. And so Lady Kidron noted in this article, the idea that it's okay to nudge kids into endless behaviors just because you're pushing their evolutionary buttons, it's not a fair fight. And I would tend to agree. One of the other spaces where we're seeing dark patterns emerge and become sort of a key central part of the discourse and linking across these many disciplinary spaces are these dreaded cookie banners that we all have to deal with now because of the enactment of GDPR. In fact, it's actually raised the specter of dark patterns into the regulatory discourse, which is actually one of the things that's excited me over the last couple of years. Just before the pandemic began, I started some conversations online with some EU legal scholars in France and the Netherlands and Australia. And we ended up writing a paper on the tensions between the legal requirements of GDPR, the design realities of dealing with these systems, and really thinking critically about what kinds of persuasion and manipulation are acceptable and appropriate and what are not. And what we've realized through that interaction, which continues to this day, is that none of these worlds are in sync. And so it's really easy to say we should legislate dark patterns out of existence. It's really difficult to actually impact design systems on the regulatory front in a really systematic way. And so one of the things that hopefully I'll be able to address today is thinking about not only the power of regulation to hopefully shape some of these behaviors, but some of the local ways in which you might be able to have impact in your own organizations. So I've sort of danced around the issue of what dark patterns are so far, and perhaps rightfully so. We can think about this as a phenomenon that exists at the intersection of stakeholder or shareholder value and user value. And so certainly there are ways to use persuasion for good. And that I think was the original goal of BJ Fogg and his persuasive principles, which a lot of people use under this label of captology to design systems for behavior change, for weight loss, for living a healthier life. There are also anti-patterns, which are simply just bad design. They have low stakeholder value and they have low user value. And then there are honest patterns, which privilege the user's voice in ways that don't always end up in the most profit. And then dark patterns exist where there's this imbalance of user value and stakeholder value. Now, the idea of dark patterns was created, it's a neologism, by Harry Brignall, who's a UX practitioner in the United Kingdom and also did a PhD in cognitive science. And when he originally was talking about this idea of dark patterns, he was essentially framing dark patterns as instances of user research where you understand the user and you understand what makes their world work and you understand how they perceive the world. And then instead of designing a system like a good UX designer would do to help that technology fit into their world, instead you use that knowledge to get the user to do whatever you want them to do. And so we can see this as a misuse of empathy or a misdirection of empathy. So he says a user interface that has been carefully crafted to trick users into doing things. It's carefully crafted. They're not mistakes. we understand what some of the human psychological principles are behind why they work. And importantly, these dark patterns don't have the user's best interests in mind. And certainly this was one of the founding definitions and still one that has a lot of validity today. In some of our early work on this topic back in 2018, we just shortened it a little bit to talk and not just about these psychological tricks, but really to frame it around any instance where user value is supplanted in favor of shareholder value. As designers within a capitalist system, we know that there always has to be shareholder value, at least for systems that are being designed for profit, but it's where that balance gets out of whack is where dark patterns often come into the conversation. So Brignall's typology originated with around 10 different kinds of patterns. One that's not on this list is confirm shaming, and that's become increasingly common over the last few years since we wrote this initial paper. And what we saw in the original dark patterns typology was a range of different dark patterns that were often linked to very specific contexts. So something like sneak into basket really only applied in an e-commerce setting. Something like price comparison prevention really only focused on e-commerce as well. And so one of the first things that we wanted to do is to figure out, are these the only kinds of dark patterns? Or are there many other kinds of dark patterns that exist? And how can we start to systematize the study of this work so that we can then build on it and do something with it? And we're not the only ones. I'll talk a little bit about the work that we've done in a minute. But this past year at the 2021 CHI conference, Arunesh Mathur and colleagues presented their work to try to pull the many different definitions that have emerged over the last few years around dark patterns into some types, some categories, so that we can sort of better understand what's in play. So it's probably a little bit too small for you to read, but he's looked at a number of different academic publications, including some of the work that we've done, and talked about dark patterns in relation to characteristics of the interface towards what is it trying to get users to do, what is the role of user interface designers, and what are some benefits and harms, and then also linking it to some of the emergent regulation in relation to dark patterns. So that's all sort of some prelude to give you a sense of where we're sort of in the national discourse in relation to dark patterns. And then we'll spend the rest of the time digging a little bit more into the work our lab has done to try to better understand what dark patterns are, to think about how dark patterns gives us an insight into how people ethically engage as designers. And then at the end, to hopefully give you some hope about what you might be able to do personally or as a UX community in the Boston area to address these concerns. So I'm going to do this in 3 parts. I'm going to start out with really trying to identify what is the community consensus around dark patterns, how can we start to distill down some of what's there, and use that to understand what dark patterns is as a phenomenon more broadly. And Flavia, yeah, I'll be happy to provide all the references that I cite tonight and get them back to the organizers. So I'll start with this idea of different dark pattern strategies and types. I mentioned to you that Brignall's categories were useful, but maybe not exhaustive. And so we wanted to dig a little bit more into that. We started by, and here are a couple of publications that I'll be happy to give copies to that really start to give you a sense of the work. The first one was our first intro paper on dark patterns to the CHI community back in 2018. And then the second piece we presented last year, looking at dark patterns sort of from a different angle through the Asshole Design subreddit. A lot of fun reading there if you aren't already a member. So we started back in 2017 collecting examples, and we really wanted to just figure out when the community says dark patterns, what do they mean? And so we ended up collecting almost 120 artifacts from a range of different places to try to see what are the examples that they're using when they say dark patterns are a problem. So we analyzed the corpus like any good researchers would do. We started with Brignall's categories in mind, and we started to think about what are the interactions that are sort of being encouraged or discouraged through the use of these patterns? What are the contexts in which these patterns are being used? And what are the user groups? Because we wanted to look at, are there certain populations that are maybe more impacted by some of these patterns than others? And what we ended up with over a period of a couple of months of analysis is a set of strategies that are a little bit different from Brignall's types. And so instead of saying there are these types that exist in the wild, which are all relevant and they're things that have face validity, we see them on a regular basis. Instead, we wanted to focus on what are some of the strategies that designers seem to be using in a broader sense that then encourages them to make these kinds of user interface decisions. And so we came up with 5 different types, a little bit easier to read than the 10 or so types from Brignall. And importantly, these were all disconnected from particular contexts of use. So none of these were e-commerce only, for instance. And so I'll give you a sense of what some of these strategies help us think about. And we also subsumed the original Brignall categories as well to give sort of a richer sense of how we could extend his work. So with nagging, we refer to a case where a designer is seeking to redirect expected functionality and that it may persist over one or more interactions. So asking people many, many times to do something, hoping that they're going to give in. And this happens in lots of different forms, as you might imagine. This is one of the classic examples that we found back in 2018, and we can probably insert some of our own examples that we've seen in our digital interactions since then. This was Apple's iCloud storage, where Apple was continuously reminding you that your disk was almost full. Great to know that your disk is almost full, but their main goal was to help you buy more storage. And so there wasn't a way to dismiss forever this notification, even if it didn't have any relevance to you. Obstruction is where the designer strategy is to impede a task flow, to know what the most efficient path is, and to make it more difficult than it needs to be, because you're trying to dissuade certain actions from happening. So this is very similar to Brignall's Roach Motel, intermediate currency, which introduces some additional friction, and the price comparison prevention, which keeps you from selecting text on a page to be able to paste it somewhere else. And so here, we see some interface interference happening here as well. But notice in the first example on the top, there's an unsubscribe link, but you can't see it because it's white text on a white background. Not that sneaky, but sneaky enough that it's going to discourage a lot of people from unsubscribing. So this adds obstruction to a task flow that would otherwise be relatively straightforward. With sneaking, we're focusing a little bit less on just making a task harder than it needs to be and focusing on the disguising, hiding, or delaying of important information. So people are able to go through the process and they don't realize until later that they've perhaps done something or signed up for something that they didn't intend to. And so there are many Brignall types that sort of relate to this: the bait and switch, the forced continuity, hidden costs, etc. And here, the goal is to sneak past the person that to the green start free trial button, countdown to help increase some of the urgency. And only if you look carefully do you see the skip offer button on the bottom. So it's not styled as a button, it's styled as text. Interface interference was by far the most common strategy that we saw in use, primarily because these screenshots that were shared on media articles were screenshots of interfaces. So you don't get a sense of the systemic dark patterns. You mainly see the patterns that relate to the interface directly. And so there were a couple of Brignall types, and then we introduced several more types around toying with emotion, false hierarchy, pre-selection, aesthetic manipulation, and hidden information. So there are lots of different ways to privilege certain actions over others because you know how humans perceive things visually or interactively, and you can use that knowledge against the user to limit the discoverability of important interactions. It's important, the muscle memory that results from playing a game. I haven't played any games because they get a little bit play and you say let's go in the middle screen, and then as soon as you don't finish the level correctly, you have the impetus to go and press in exactly the same place to start the level again, but no, they've changed the position down, so now you're going to use one of your boosts. That's their in-game economy. If you use up your free boost, then you have to buy boosts. So it is pointing towards how the interface can actually lead to these larger systemic dark patterns concerns. And then the final one is forced action, and it's where they're not trying to be sneaky about it. They're not trying to like engineer the interface. They're just requiring you to do a specific thing to access or continue accessing specific functionality. So we see this frequently with gamification or with social pyramid, where you have to invite friends to be able to move forward with a game or move forward on a social media platform. And this is a great example, which was eventually banned by Apple, but essentially saying we keep on asking, we nag you to turn on notifications. There's no way to say no. There's only a way to say not now. So it's forced action. We're going to continue making you engage in this interaction over and over again. So there is a collection of these examples, which Ike has kindly added in the chat already. And so all of the examples that we addressed in the CHI paper are there, and you can filter down by various types. We would like to refresh the examples, but we just keep on finding new research questions, which keep us from adding more stuff to the website. But it's there, and it's a useful resource if you wanted to dig a little bit more. The other side of this that we wanted to understand is how everyday users are maybe recognizing that they're being manipulated, and what are they doing about it? And so when I first started engaging in this asshole design million members, by last year it had 1.4 million members, and it's up to almost 2 million members now. So quite a popular Reddit. When assholes design things, so why wouldn't you want to join and see how asshole designers operate? And so our goal here was to really collect some posts, see what they were talking about, and see whether there was actually an aligned definition for asshole design, and to see how asshole design might differ from the dark pattern strategies I've already talked about. And so you can see that 2/3 of the posts, over 2/3 of the posts, align with the community's definition for asshole design. Pretty remarkable, actually. It is a moderated community, but still with large communities, it can be very difficult to maintain that kind of quality. And the vast majority, the plurality of those posts also contain dark patterns. So that says to us, there's a strong alignment between what people are perceiving as stuff that is designed by an asshole designer and things that we already know from the design literature is incorporating dark patterns. There were some things that were asshole design, but that were new as well. And so that's what we really focused on, because we already had a good sense of what those dark pattern strategies looked like otherwise. So we looked at these things, we did some content analysis, some similar things to the previous study that I mentioned. And we tried to identify what are some differences and similarities between dark patterns and asshole designs, and maybe what are some designer properties that we could point towards that might give us a sense of how this phenomenon might be different. And these are the 6 properties we came up with. There are some overlaps with dark patterns, but the difference here is that instead of trying to be sneaky about it, instead of trying to carefully use human psychology against the user, they're actually being very blatant about the fact that they're trying to manipulate you. They're being transparent about that. And so you're seeing coerciveness in these design examples in ways that are very readily accessible, but there's not a lot that users can do about it in most of these cases. So I'll show you just one example where this is being two-faced, where designers provide contradictory and conflicting information that confuses the user. And here you're downloading a free ad blocker browser, and the ad blocker contains ads. And so there's a strong disconnect there between what you're asking the user to do and then sort of the way that you're projecting the value of your product. And we actually posted this on the subreddit, because why not? And actually somebody else beat us to it. And so they posted this last summer, got a lot of engagement. And in fact, people were very interested in the fact that they were being studied, which I think is an interesting phenomenon in its own right. And this also coincided with their 1 millionth member that had joined around that time last summer. And they posted something that I think was really useful for me to read as an educator, and I think may be useful for you in thinking about these unethical practices as a designer as well. And so here's what they talk about when they say this is the purpose of our community. Every time you call out a company for their bullshit, you're helping to reinforce the sentiment that we're not simply mindless consumers. We're not asking for the impossible. We're not asking that everything on the internet be free and immediately available for everyone everywhere, which, by the way, is one of the things that one of our reviewers told us. But we want to give the respect that comes from a two-way relationship that user and stakeholder value again. We give their website hits of business, and in return, they don't try to force us to jump through hoops just so they can get a teeny tiny bit more out of us. We are users, but we don't like being used. And so I think that was a nice reflective point for us to realize that there were these on the ground investigations of these practices that weren't necessarily connected to the design and technology space, but were addressing a lot of the same concerns we were seeing in design and technology practice. So now I'm going to shift off into ethical trade-offs, thinking about how these design decisions are mediated and what kinds of complexity emerges which makes our lives difficult. It's the stuff that gives us heartburn at night because we don't know how exactly to balance all of these concerns and know what the right path is forward and know, what kinds of social impact might be just around the corner. And so here we did this through two main studies. The ethical mediation in UX practice paper that we presented in 2019 at CHI was focused on observational work that we did at several technology companies, where we observed designers in action and tried to better understand what their experiences were like. And then the second article here, also from CHI 2019, was where we actually sat design teams in an academic setting into a room. We did a lab protocol study, gave them an ethically problematic task, and then wanted to see what they did about it. And the results were a little bit surprising. So I'll start out with the lab protocol. Pretty typical psychology lab study, which has often been used in the design literature as well. We gave them a design task. We asked them to solve it, and we gave them about 45 minutes as a group of 3. And we video recorded them all and all that stuff. We ended up conducting 12 sessions across 3 different design tasks, including a total of 36 students from user experience design, from industrial design, and from industrial engineering, all the kinds of people that would be getting jobs or looking for jobs in the UX space, broadly speaking. And the protocols got progressively more evil. So we started out with, can we get people to encourage users to donate to a nonprofit, good cause? So it's probably better to manipulate people for that purpose than maybe another purpose. Would they persuade people? The answer was yes, they definitely would. They would definitely employ lots of dark patterns. The second protocol, we wanted to figure out, let's make it a commercial product. Let's make it a capitalist endeavor. So we're going to say, do some work on behalf of a web-based pharmacy, and don't just encourage them, particularly prioritize the company brand products over their competitors. Would they do that? Would they engage in those practices to manipulate and persuade users? In fact, they would. They were more than happy to do so. And finally, and this is the protocol that I'll play around with a little bit more, we asked them to redesign the application attached to Amazon Alexa and try to get people to consent to having all their data collected, which is probably already happening anyway. But that was the task we gave them. And they were more than willing to do that as well. But how they engaged in those practices was, I think, a little bit more important than the fact that they were unable to reframe the design situation to find a more ethical path forward, or to just reject the brief and say, this is not something that I'm willing to do, which is something that they were able to do, but nobody did. So what we found in that third protocol session was these interactions where people were aware that they were doing something problematic. They weren't necessarily aware how to escape it, though. And so instead, they ended up softening the task in certain ways to try to address some of the ethical complexity of what they saw. So there's one bit of the conversation that I'll sort of walk you through briefly. So 3 participants, a mix of UX and IE people here. So the first participant said, how can we help the company always listen in on user conversations? That was the essence of the design brief. One of them suggested, well, we could reword the user agreement so that people are agreeing to things that they might not otherwise. And we had given them some wireframes to play off of, so they had something to start from. Another person said, well, the goal is that we want people to say yes, but I personally wouldn't. There's a disconnect there between the things that we ask users to do, the things that the designer is willing to do themselves. And then immediately they softened the claim. So they said, this is not something I'm comfortable with, but we could say that if they agree to it, they're going to get more features, and everybody loves features, right? So the first person then says, okay, I'm going to frame that in the form of a solution. We're going to allow Alexa to listen to you in order to give you better features, like song suggestions. Sounds great, right? And so what we see there are these interactions where they are identifying that there are potentially some problems, but instead of investigating the problems, they find ways to reframe it just enough that they don't feel like they're doing something super duper evil. And we saw some themes come up across many of these interactions among the student designers, all of which who had some professional design experience. For one person, they said, it's between me and my job. What am I going to do? Am I going to quit my job over this? And in fact, they weren't even being asked to quit their job in this case. They're going to get the money regardless. Another person was very aware of the ethical situation in relation to their own discipline. And so here this student said, I know what the industrial engineering standard is for ethics because they have a code of ethics that they're taught about. You should make everything approachable. You should be able to find everything really easily. But in this case, I want to bury the information because I want to meet that stakeholder's goals and not necessarily the goal that my discipline has set out. And Dan, yes, this is satisficing is something we always have to do as designers. I think the key here that we're seeing is that they're not really seeking to navigate the ethical dimensions of satisficing. They're only really navigating the dimensions around, here's what I'm asked to do. What is a way to do that thing without feeling totally crummy about myself, rather than imagining other forms of satisficing that might emerge. This is something we've seen in practice as well. And another designer was a little bit more blunt and said, you know, I just realized and I remembered we're not designing for the user, we're designing for the company, which is a reality of doing this work, but perhaps not something that you want somebody trained in user-centered design to maybe be saying out loud. Okay, so that's what we saw from the lab protocols, an inability to sort of reframe the design problem and an inability to really navigate some of the ethical complexity in a way that could lead to better outcomes for users. And maybe a narrowing of focus for the stakeholders that were involved. So Tally, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, asks if they knew they were part of a study or if they were actually doing the design project. There is that it wasn't real component. We had told them initially that it was a deception study. And so we told them that, not that they were working for the actual company, but we told them that we were just studying their design decision-making. Nothing other than that. And it wasn't until the end of the session that we revealed that we were actually studying their ethical practices. They were debriefed and they still consented for their data to be used as part of the study. So there is a sense in which it's not real, but in fact, a lot of the students were notably uncomfortable as they were doing the work. And we were surprised that nobody actually ended up rejecting the brief, given the pain that it seemed to be causing them. So in the second study, we were looking at people in an observational setting where multiple researchers are going out into the field. We're using ethnographic observational techniques and really trying to figure out what that on the ground ecological complexity was. We did follow-up interviews with these individuals as well, and then we ended up writing these up as cases as part of the CHI paper that I mentioned, using a combination of field notes that we combined across all the researchers and the interview transcripts. And so we built up those cases over time using a thematic analysis approach and tried to really understand what was that ethical complexity that these practitioners were facing and what were they doing about it. And we really distilled this around three key areas. What were the individual practices that were being taken on by the designer that we were focusing on? What were the broader organizational practices that those individual practices were mediated by? And what are some specific examples that popped up in our interactions that had relevance to how they might be able to act ethically or not? So we ended up structuring our work around three different designers with different kinds of years of experience working in different work environments with a combination of B2C and B2B. I think there's somebody that has an open line. If we could maybe mute them, Joe. I can't see the participant list in my setup right now. So we observed them, we engaged with them over multiple sessions so we could sort of see the longitudinal progression of some of these interactions, and then we did some follow-up interviews with them. So I'm not going to be able to go in depth into all of what we found because there's a lot there and all of it's in the paper, but there were definitely different approaches and framings of ethics and ethical complexity that emerged on the part of these various practitioners. We're going to focus on James. One of the richer cases, to be honest. We were able to spend more time with him, and there were some interesting ethical practices that emerged in relation to his work. And so he was very focused on trying to always be aware of the things that were out there. He was constantly reading, constantly trying to figure out what are the new emerging topics that I need to be expert in and that my organization needs to be expert in. He was in a management role within his organization as a principal designer. And so he was also trying to figure out what are some strategies to build the capacity of other people that work in my small agency, and how can I build their ethical character so that they too can make better moral judgments about whether certain work should be done or not. And he was always thinking about balancing these trade-offs, knowing when have we gone too far, knowing when maybe it crossed the line of organizational values, and to be able to say, that's great work, but that's not the kind of work that our organization is willing to do. We then looked at this from an ecological perspective. And this is where we really started to distill what some of that ecological complexity looked like. And we started to think about what are the individual practices that somebody comes in with, how are those related to and mediated by organizational practices, and then what are the kinds of applied ethics that help people engage in discerning those trade-offs, and then what are all of those interactions across all those different connection points. And so we can sort of see that James, in this case, was simultaneously constrained and enabled by organizational individual practice. He got to play a little bit on both sides of the fence. He was able to impact the construction of values for his agency environment. And then he was also able to constrain the ethical actions of his employees because he was able to get that buy-in at the higher level. We can also see that he was able to learn from other disciplinary perspectives, bringing in different modes of applied ethics, and not just relying on one mode or one code of ethics to really address these concerns. And so he's constantly trying to strengthen and broaden his ethical foundations and engage in clear conversations about issues that he felt were important to address, like technology addiction. So this led us to a concept which we call ethical design complexity. It's probably something you have all felt. It's maybe one of those things that has given you heartburn at night. But in the fancy academic language, we talk about these as complex and choreographed arrangements of ethical considerations that the designer has to mediate. They have to mediate those decisions in relation to their organization and what their organization is willing to support and allow. In relation to their own individual practices, what are they able to do and what do they wish they were able to do? And what are some ethical frameworks, informal or formal, that they might rely upon to understand what is something that is that bridge too far on the road to hell that Glaser talked about, and what is something that they're still reasonably willing to do. Okay, so we've gone through work relating to community consensus, and then I just finished this section on really understanding what is this ethical complexity that's felt, and what are some of the challenges that people have to work through to do work that is maybe ethically aware or ethically responsive. In this final section, we're in work that is still sort of actively in process. And so there may be some rougher edges, but I want to share some of what we're up to and how it might support some of your own practices. And then also point you towards some resources that we'll hopefully be launching later this year. So here, the focus is on possibilities for action, what we can do to ethically engage, not just give up, not just say it's a problem, but we don't really have the capacity to care or the time to care. So here, the first article here is in preprint right now. It is under journal review, but we put it up on archive, so it's freely available. And this is surveying the landscape of ethics-focused design methods. This is based on an analysis we did to try to find as many resources as we could that help to inspire or help designers reflect on ethics as part of their everyday practice. And we were surprised by how many artifacts we found that are probably not things that you might be aware of in your everyday practice. The second piece we just presented at CHI back in May, specifically focusing on understanding what is that felt complexity that I talked about earlier, but from the individual designers or technologists' perspective, and how can we use that to better understand how those designers might be better aware or better able to act, and what are some of the things that are inhibiting or allowing extension of those behaviors. So I'm going to start out with this idea of identity claims. And so here we're focusing on that person that is doing the design works, all of you on the call. What are the kinds of things that you are aware of as you're deciding what do I understand? What am I able to sense make about what's happening? What do I think I'm able to do? And what's limiting me, holding me back, or what's enabling me to push forward? So similar format is what you've seen for some other things. We did a number of interviews with technology practitioners. I think it was about 13 at this stage, which ended up being about 30 interviews in total by the end. We did some reflexive thematic analysis to understand what happened and try to figure out what are those identity claims that are in play. And then we ended up coming up with a list of 8 different identities that people can take on. And as probably many of you know, we always operate within many different kinds of identities. So, I'm a professor. I just taught a 3-hour studio before coming onto this call. But I'm also a husband. I also am apparently a expert on dark patterns. So there are lots of different roles that we play. I used to be a graphic designer. So we distilled 8 different so-called identity claims to really try to understand what some of that complexity was. So we identified that people are seeking to educate. They see themselves as an educator within their workplace. They want to share knowledge with others. They're a learner. They realize that they don't have sufficient knowledge to address the challenges that they're facing, and they need to improve their capabilities over time. That their goal is to translate things. So they're trying to translate things from discipline to discipline or from one experiential context to another. They're a policy follower, that they really want to make sure that they're doing all the things that they should right from a legal perspective. They're an activist or advocate. They want to change the state of affairs. They want to make things better, whatever better means. They're deliberative or thoughtful, where they're constantly internally questioning what they should trust or what they should act upon and why. They're a member of their profession. So I do this because this is what all UX designers do, or I do this because software engineers care about this thing. So this is part of their disciplinary rhetoric. And then the final one, I have a sense of responsibility. They consider the current and future impact of their work. And so this is maybe useful as a starting point to just sort of start to understand why this is such a difficult and complex space to work in. But we also used it as a way to negotiate what is, these aren't quite personas, because these are things that we can occupy, we all occupy, and we occupy them in combination. And some of these are identities that we prioritize at certain times of day or within certain kinds of interactions. And what we found to be especially useful for the practitioners that we interviewed is that when they were ethically engaging through different identity claims. And so the kinds of issues that you can address from an ethical perspective, from a policy follower perspective, are very different from I have a sense of responsibility. Because responsibility can transcend organization, can transcend discipline, but a sense of responsibility could be like, here's what I'm like as a human being. How can I be a human in the context in which I'm trying to do design work? And so that's a little bit different. Similarly, I'm a member of profession, can shut down the conversation and say, my discipline doesn't care about this thing, so I don't need to care about it either. But if you come in saying, I'm a learner and I'm a translator and I want to figure out how to act on these concerns, then it actually opens up the space for ethical action instead. It's a great question. So there are a few stories that we saw where people were starting to connect these as trajectories. I'm not going to go in depth here, but I'm just going to try to give you a taste of what's happening. So in this sense, we had practitioners start by saying, I have a sense of responsibility. That led them to be an activist when they were presented with an ethically problematic situation. And so we're seeing that they might have held both of those identity claims, but which one they foregrounded at which time became really important. And importantly here, it wasn't even that what they were advocating for was linked to their responsibility as a member of their profession. This was just something that as a human being, they thought was problematic. So for instance, in one example, a UX design participant shared a conflict where he tried to push the conversation with his manager and teammates about a vulnerability in a system that compromised users' data privacy, even though he knew it wasn't his responsibility as a UX practitioner. In this example, advocacy emerged from a broader sense of values and morality rather than beginning within the space occupied by disciplinary or professional ethics. Saw lots of other interaction trajectories. These were probably not the only ones, but these were some of the ones that we saw very commonly in our data set, where they could be symbiotic, like the first one, where individual practices could inform and inscribe applied ethics. Applied ethics could then strengthen individual practices. Or in the case of interaction trajectory B, where the organizational practices shaped the ways that people were able to act, often shutting it down in certain ways. And we also often saw people saying, I'm a learner, I'm constantly trying to learn new things. And because I know these new things, now I have a desire to go teach those things to others within my organization. So I am an educator. And in this final example, we start to see also those interchanges between that ethical complexity diagram I showed you earlier and some of the identity claims that we were able to identify. And so in this case, I'm going to dig a little bit more into the individual practices and applied ethics interaction. And so with one of our participants, they wanted to understand what they can have a voice about and what they don't. So that's the I have a sense of responsibility. And they were also a CEO. And so they were able to have the luxury of starting by building the company's values together as a team. And so here we saw this participant being able to translate this responsibility into tangible acts of advocacy, which could then inscribe that advocacy into their responsibility for future design outcomes. So in this last piece that I have, we're going to talk a little bit about those ethics-focused methods I alluded to earlier. And here we started with 89 methods, tools, or approaches that we found in the academic literature, but also on websites and things that practitioners have offered back to the community more openly. We did some analysis to try to understand what was there, and we ended up with 63 tools that we could frame as design methods. And we also identified some of the functioning components of them that we can start to use to figure out what are the ways that that might inspire future action. In the archive paper, you can see this table. This is just a small snippet of the overall 2-page table, but we did lots of content analysis to then describe these different techniques from a number of different perspectives. And in particular, what I want to focus on here is to note the context where we identified whether these were team or individual, whether these were primarily industry, or whether they were really built for educational environments, and where they may fit within, the typical 5-stage depiction of design phases. That's also used in the universal methods of design. What I want to focus on here are the cores and input mechanic output routines. And so the cores are really what is central to the doing of that method, which we can sort of abstract away, and then you can start to see what is the ethical character of some of those interactions and the ways that methods can support that work. And then in the input mechanics output, you can start to see that there are a range of different ways that you might start engaging with methods that then can help lead towards more ethically responsible outcomes, or at least guidance that might shape downstream design behaviors. And so the cores that we found in 2 different categories. The first one were postures towards design activity, and these were all very ethically focused. So eliciting values, figuring out what values are in play and how to practice and apply them. Critically engaging, sort of thinking about and considering these alternative perspectives. And then defamiliarizing, being able to see the situation from a new perspective and understand from that perspective what new ethical responsibilities might emerge. There were also action cores, and these are a little bit more generic. These apply to any design method. So methods that are more oriented towards building consensus within a team or an organization, methods that are more focused around evaluation or more focused around how we're framing the problem and understanding it together. The final thing I want to share here are the input mechanics and output. These are non-exclusively related to each other. And so any given method can have multiple inputs, multiple mechanics, and multiple outputs. So you can see there are a lot of different kinds of inputs, from design artifacts to constraints to user data to values that you might want to be able to embody. And then those mechanics tell you what you're going to be doing with that information. So are you going to alter stuff? Are you going to create new stuff? Are you going to storytell to identify new opportunities? Are you going to filter or evaluate? And then those outputs are what you can use to impact downstream design activity once you've engaged with the method. And so maybe it gives you some new concepts to consider. Maybe it gives you new information about users you didn't have before. Maybe it results in a set of values that you might then want to embody and use to incorporate into your practice. So this set of methods and some of the language around it may be useful as you consider what can I maybe do in my organization or in my individual practices to maybe embody some of these ethical perspectives a little bit more broadly. So we've looked across a range of different studies that my lab has conducted over the last several years, thinking about the community consensus around dark patterns, the ethical complexity more broadly faced in technology practice, and what we can do about it. And what I want to close with is really just to indicate that evil design can take a lot of forms. It's really easy to point towards the dark patterns and say, I'm not going to be that kind of designer, or to be an asshole designer. I'm not going to do that. And that's what I've mainly been focusing on today. But there are lots of different ways that we can do bad work or do work that is maybe evilly motivated in many different framings. So even with civic design or participatory design, which is really focusing on these critical dimensions, you can really easily be evil by just not including people at the table that deserve to have a seat at the table. With user-centered design and human-centered design, you can be evil by just shooting for empathy light, as John Coco has talked about it, instead of actually building true empathy with the communities you're designing for. With generic capitalist design, you can see humans only as customers and rob them of their agency and their humanness. With dark patterns, as you've seen, we can reduce users' agency and value in really particular ways that get them to do what we want them to do to build profit. And with asshole design, we simply coerce users. So there are many ways of being evil, but hopefully there are some ways of being ethically responsive as well. And this is where I'll close. What can we do? Here's some ideas based off of the last several years of research that we've been doing, some of which may be more relevant for you in your organizational and practice setting than others. One is just to become more ethically aware, realize that this is something that we constantly have to learn about. There are constantly new angles that we have to expose ourselves to, like dark patterns. Also to seek to educate others and learn. Not everyone's starting from the same place. Some disciplines have strong training in ethics, many do not. And a lot of the ethical challenges that are emerging every day in the technology practice require us to continually learn. We should try to leverage company values or create new ones if they don't exist, to try to create at least some resonance that encourages ethical action that is ecologically sensitive. As I just mentioned, with that set of 63 design methods, we can use methods to surface and address issues in ways that we might not currently be aware of. And on the regulatory front, we can call for, and hopefully even as a design community, shape regulation so that we have more restrictions around which practices should be completely illegal and which practices we need to maybe better understand and shape as they move forward. Finally, impact the future of your profession. Think about what kind of profession do you want to have? What is its relationship to ethics? And how can we incorporate these features of our work, not as a peripheral thing, but actually something that is at the center, at the heart of doing human-centered design work. So with that, thank you so much. I invite any questions that you might have, and thank you for your attention. Okay, it looks like there's a question from Dan about whether I've looked into or thought about the idea of accountability for those that have power over how UX is practiced. I mean, this is, I think, a contentious topic. There are certainly people that have had inflamed Twitter wars around whether we need certifications or other means of controlling who gets to practice as a designer. I think there's some reasonable arguments to be made for that, but I don't know if that they're sustainable in the ways that our organizations and our professions are organized. And I don't know that that actually gets to the heart of some of the problems here either. So we can look at fields where they have had a strong history of professionalization and of restricting access to the profession, like architecture, like engineering. And in fact, we see failures in those spaces as well, maybe not as dramatic, but certainly just being a professional engineer through licensure doesn't guarantee that there won't be consequences downstream. I think one of the biggest challenges in relation to technology practice is that so many of the potentials for social impact, negative social impact, are unknown. And many people in the discipline are okay with them being unknown unknowns and not really trying to find out what those things might be. And so, many of the large social media platforms on which we, live out large portions of our life these days, there are some real challenges around free speech, around intimidation and bullying and harassment, around data privacy, which could have been addressed up front, but the build fast and break things methodology doesn't generally privilege those kinds of interactions. So yeah, I love the idea of increasing accountability towards the practice of UX, but I think it's probably a little bit too late to the game to start to think about licensure. And the academic profiles of people coming into the field are incredibly diverse in ways that we really don't, it's not a known product what the kinds of ethical training even would be for people entering the discipline for the first time. So Dan, I'm not sure if that helped. You also said the business leaders who establish the constraints in which design is practiced. I think that is one of the real opportunities to really think about this from an organizational perspective, because the discipline of UX and HCI is just very fragmented. We've done previous research to describe it as a volatile community of practice because it's constantly shape-shifting in ways that are really challenging from an educational perspective and also from a professional perspective. But this same volatility exists within organizations as well. And actually, in some of our interviews that we've conducted over this last 6 months or so with design leaders that are sort of in those CDO kinds of positions or director levels, what we've actually seen is this sort of contrast between what they see as these incoming designers and technologists into the companies that are quite ethically aware, or at least interested in being aware. Interested in engaging with social justice and things, but that sort of the old guard of design, the ones that crafted many of the experiences that we're existing in now, existed in a time when art and design schools did not really engage in ethics, and it wasn't a core part of their training. I know it wasn't for me when I was doing my first couple of degrees in design, and so I feel like we might almost have a war brewing internally between people that are in these chief kinds of design positions and don't understand why this is such a big deal, and lots of people who want to do good by humanity in their roles, and then trying to really navigate those tensions is going to be increasingly important. Okay, Rebecca asks, what role do others on product teams have in regards to creating products that are ethically designed and built? That's a great question, and it's one that we're working on actively right now. So as I mentioned earlier, we had interviewed about 13 people for the CHI paper, and then we continued expanding that data set, looking at people from a range of different technology disciplines. And we just submitted a paper last week to CHI, so we'll see how that goes. But specifically focusing on how different people from these different perspectives do engage in talking about ethics differently, which impacts the ways that you can actually work together to work on what is hopefully an ethically sound product. And so certainly some disciplines prioritize some of these ethical perspectives more than others. What we found predominantly in our work is that UX designers and UX researchers were normally the people that were cared about these things, and they were also the scapegoat that other people said, well, I don't need to care about this because our UX designers or our product managers do. And so certainly there are some pieces of disciplinary purview that I think are an opportunity for change. But a lot of this starts with some of that ethical awareness and figuring out how to distribute that ethical responsibility rather than centering it only in one ethical role. Now, that said, there are some models, particularly in Europe, around having professional ethicists that work on design teams in a more direct manner. And certainly large companies in the United States sometimes have people in that role as well, but often it's less around ethics and more around regulation and legal liability. And so thinking about how to engage people in these conversations across multiple disciplinary roles is super duper important. Okay, Flavia asks, do you know more research on how users accept or not accept dark patterns designs? There is a lot of incoming literature on this just over the last 18 months or so, and I'd be more than happy to provide some more specific resources if you reach out to me on my email. It's gray42@purdue.edu. Put simply, yes, people are relatively aware that they are being manipulated. And so a recent survey study that we just had published showed that upwards of 80% of people sort of recognize that they're being manipulated in their everyday interactions with technologies. The degree to which they're aware of specific dark pattern strategies, the awareness is relatively low. And what other scholars have found, particularly those doing work in Northern Europe, have found that people, even if they're aware, it does help them be a little bit more conscientious or cognizant of their interactions moving forward, but it doesn't actually alter the broader effects of dark patterns. Another recent study that came out from a legal perspective where they did this experimentally, they found that certain dark patterns were more destructive and more impactful than others. They actually found that educational status mattered. We haven't seen that in our work as profoundly. And that certain strategies might work better against people that are maybe less educated. And so there are lots of different facets of this that we're just starting to see emerge. And I think this is a space that the FTC in particular in the United States is going to be interested in pursuing a little bit more aggressively than perhaps they would have over the last 4 years. These are all great questions. Thank you. So Sarah asks, what about intentional dark patterns versus dark things happening because of a lack of diversity of perspective and attention to how things could go wrong? It's a really important distinction, and we have focused primarily on the kinds of design decisions that are made that appear to have a motivation for profit. And so there are certainly different kinds of decisions that could have disempowering impact or impact users disproportionately because of any number of intersectional characteristics. And that was not the focus of our work. It is a really important set of questions to sort of bring up, though. There are other people in the HCI community that are doing work around particular sort of sets of intersectional characteristics. So for instance, people in low income populations, or Margaret Burnett's work on gender mag to sort of think about the impacts of not considering gender carefully and completely in the design of technology products. But a lot of that, I think, tends to move beyond the dark patterns discourse, at least as it was originally framed by Brignall. So Marine asks, are there liabilities in calling out dark patterns in SL designs? What kinds of difficulties have we found in bringing perpetrators to light? It's actually interesting. I didn't mention this part of the story, but Brignall originally proposed the concept of dark patterns because he wanted to shame people into doing the right thing. And so this started his campaign of people sharing stuff on Twitter and on the darkpatterns.org site to, quote, name and shame companies. And that was one of the original parallel hashtags that was being used in relation to dark patterns. And the idea was, if we just like anger the populace and get people talking about the fact that people are doing these things, then they'll stop. And in fact, the opposite has happened. We've seen the kinds of dark patterns and their use in everyday products proliferate. Why? Because they're dramatically successful. And it meets all of those growth hacking targets that we've seen many KPIs being related to very strongly. And so we're actually seeing sort of the opposite effect than I think Harry originally had wanted. I don't think there's any particular liability around calling out these concerns. And for me as an academic, I'm a little bit less concerned about that in my position anyway. But we have seen some great examples of practitioners doing dark patterns teardowns of products and sharing them through Medium articles and other things like that. And indeed, there are now some legal cases that are relating to the use of dark patterns that could have the potential to impact downstream design practices in ways that are not quite certain yet. Okay, Kent asks, what role what might cognitive bias play, particularly the empathy gap and confirmation bias? They certainly do come into play. And so this is, I think, one of the extensions of this concept of dark patterns that we're starting to see in the literature, and it's by no means complete. Because our paper was in 2018, we've seen this surge of interest just in these past 3 years. The original ideas were primarily around the principles of cognitive psychology. So around perception, how people interpret digital interfaces, and then how can we sort of manipulate some of those interpretable practices. Increasingly, though, a lot of the practices that are being used in relation to dark patterns are more strongly related to social psychology than perhaps cognitive psychology. And so Matur's latest article, I'd maybe encourage you to take a look, but he does deal a little bit more with some of these attitudinal characteristics that relate to the success of dark patterns, and not just the ability to sneak something past somebody because you're using a cheap trick. We see sort of something at the intersection of that is something like confirm shaming, where you're creating sort of a toxic environment, but you're also getting people to do things that you want them to do. And with confirmation bias in particular, that is something that we very commonly see in e-commerce environments, particularly around instances of social proof, for instance. So Amalia asks, does a consumer's cultural background or upbringing affect the way that they interact with dark patterns? It's a great question, and it's not one that I've seen investigated yet. There are a number of studies that have come out, but most of them are just over the past 18 to 24 months, actually, that start to engage more deeply with how regular everyday people perceive some of these patterns. And there's not enough in the literature yet to really make any claims around the impact of cultural background or upbringing. Like I said, this legal paper that I was referring to, they did show, at least with some strategies, a gap relating to educational background. So that might be one thing to look at. In our lab, actually, we have some people looking at this from a Chinese and Indian context to really try to better understand are their local interpretations of dark patterns. And we haven't come to any solid conclusions yet, so maybe stay tuned. But it's a great question and something great to think about. Varnell asks, is the research limited to UI behaviors? What about management, leadership implication, dark patterns? So yeah, no, this is another great question. And this is actually, I think, what we're starting to see with the broadening of the discourse, because the original aims of Brignall were so focused on these dark patterns, which were visible as design patterns in the ways that we typically talk about them in UI design. And increasingly, what we're finding matters a lot more. Yes, these patterns are bad and they probably shouldn't be used. But what tends to be even more impactful is when these patterns are used in combination, which is often really difficult to trace just in the moment. So there are these temporal characteristics, and there are these multiplicative effects that we're starting to see where many dark patterns are being used in sequence. And when they're used in sequence, you might be able to ignore one or two or be a little bit more aware in the moment and get past one or two of them, but are you gonna get past 5 or 10? That's where I think this space is going to start going. And so here, it's less dark pattern as a specific UI pattern that you might be able to capture in real space and time, and more around what did dark patterns look like from a systemic perspective, where there are many different kinds of strategy that are actually discouraging user agency and privileging the stakeholder perspective. And I think one of the best examples that's come out this year is actually from a regulator in Norway, or the regulatory office in Norway, where they actually did a 15 or 20 page teardown of how difficult it is to unsubscribe from Amazon Prime. I've never tried, but I hear it's really difficult. And they showed across, a dozen or more screens, all the different decisions that you had to make to get to a point where you could actually unsubscribe. This is more than just dark patterns, as Brignall was talking about it originally. I think this is where we're starting to get these allusions towards what dark patterns as systemic might look like. Okay, Joe, I love this one. Show designers what it's like to be inside ethical quandaries like this that lead to dark patterns. This is something that we're very interested in at the moment. Because it's something we called for in a paper that just came out last month, where we looked at the different roles that computing students take on in relation to some of these ethical quandaries, where we, as I mentioned earlier in the lab protocols, we found that they actually found lots of ways to connive, to engage in the dark side, and very little to engage in the light side, or engagement in bright patterns. And so this is actually a call that we've made back out to the computing education space to say, most of ethics training has been around saying, here's a consequentialist framework, or here's a deontological framework, here's a case study, reason with that framework, and you will then be certified as an ethicist or certified as ethics aware. And I think what we've shown in the work that I've shared with you today is that knowledge is not enough here. Like, you can know all of the ethics and know what your code of ethics says, but when you're pressed up against the wall and you have to make a decision, how are you going to actually navigate that terrain and hopefully get other people on board thinking through ethical impact along many of these different dimensions? So I think, calling for these more ecologically aware kinds of ethical quandaries and not just these sort of static design cases is going to be really important to preparing the next generation of designers. Yes, okay, so Zachary asks about the intersection between dark patterns and stuff in behavioral economics and nudges. There certainly are some intersections between these spaces, and certainly you've seen the conversation around nudging be contrasted more recently with sledge. And so when is the nudging good and when is it bad because it maybe doesn't privilege the user perspective in the ways that it should. So I think in many ways that behavioral economics angle is addressing a lot of the same core concerns here that Brignall was really addressing in relation to BJ Fogg's persuasive principles from the late 1990s. Just a newer interpretation of a lot of the same stuff. I'm not suggesting that behavioral economics perspectives aren't going to bring anything new, and actually behavioral economics does have, I think, a more solid framing of things like cognitive bias that the dark patterns conversation could really benefit from. But I see these as spaces that are probably separate right now in terms of discourse, but they might have the potential to very rapidly converge as well. Okay, I got a direct message. I won't say who it's from, just so I don't reveal their identity. But they ask, maybe in relation to Joe's question as well, do we think it's possible to eradicate these dark patterns through new ways of educating the next generation of designers? Or is this just like what it's like to do capitalist design work, where you put the company first over the customer? How do you want my optimistic answer or my realist answer? Gosh, we have 150 undergraduate UX design students on campus. And so this is something I think about a lot, because most of them, 90+% of them, are going to go work in the private sector for capitalist enterprise. And so I certainly don't want to go too far towards one side, which some people have, where they make their students feel so awkward about working within capitalism that they are unemployable, or feel so shamed at the fact that they have to do work to get money and put food on the table, all that good stuff. But I think there's probably more to that spectrum than just make them uncomfortable to take any capitalist job, or actively, enthusiastically commit to whatever kind of job lands in their lap. And that's where we probably need to do a little bit more work helping people navigate their own ethical standpoint and really understand where they fit on that Glazer road to hell. Now, I have some clear ideas about where I'd love for our students to maybe drop off the road to hell and not go any further. But ultimately, it's a decision that each individual design student needs to make, and that is then going to evolve over time. We do that specifically around the practice of students writing a design philosophy and really thinking deeply about what are the values that they seek to uphold, what are the things that they think are important about design work, and then how is that going to influence the ways that they look for jobs and internships as well. So we see this as an alignment of these value constructs and also sort of thinking about design engagement more broadly. So I don't know that there's an answer. I hope that we're heading in the right direction, because if you look at the conversation in design education and technology education over the last half century, since Papanek wrote his article, Design for the Real World in 1970, I don't think we've made much progress, but I think we're finally starting to get some interest around some of these key issues in ways that are exciting. Alex asks, has there been any progress in making dark patterns illegal? It's a wonderful question. Not yet, but with an asterisk. So where things sort of stand is that dark patterns, by that term, has been put into multiple pieces of legislation in the United States now, including the CCPA. Now, it's under active negotiation what that term actually means in the context of the legislation. And that, I think, where the rubber hits the road is going to tell us whether that is a useful term or whether it ends up becoming a legally useless term. I don't know yet. I will tell you, my EU colleagues, they're maybe a little bit jealous at times that GDPR doesn't have dark patterns in the legislation, because they're having to work from some of the rights and responsibilities that relate to the data privacy directive more generally, and then trying to see like, how is that violated by various dark patterns? Whereas we'll have a more direct conduit, but it will come down to who gets to decide what dark patterns actually are. Okay. Probably one of our last questions. Dan asks, startup product managers and others will continue to find ways to implement dark patterns without involving designers or being aware of the concept of design. Absolutely. So certainly Brignall's original vision of dark patterns was towards the design community. I think that's too narrow. And I think even Harry, if he was here himself, would say that it's probably too narrow these days, that there are more people that need to be involved. And so the grant that I've been working on with students over the last 2 years, building on our dark patterns work, is all about thinking about not just UX designers should be more ethically aware. Let's give them the support to do that. But everyone needs to be ethically aware and be able to ethically act. And so that's product managers, that's software engineers, that's data scientists, that's hardware engineers. It's everyone. And so just like we've seen in the privacy discourse, where there's this move towards privacy by design, where everyone needs to care about privacy and everyone needs to care about security, I think the same thing needs to happen in relation to ethics and dark patterns as well. So nobody gets a free ticket. Possibly the end of the long line of questions. These are really, really great. Joe, if you want to do any other wrap up here, that would be fantastic.
Okay, I guess nothing from me other than thank you so much, Colin, for taking the time to talk to us today. This was fascinating, and yeah, thanks everybody for the amazing questions. Have a wonderful evening.